Okay, time to start talking about muscle. We're going to divide this into two parts. This little lecture, or this little segment, will be on the macro or large scale anatomy of muscle, and then we'll go into the micro or small scale of muscle in the next video. Okay? So, some fun factoids to begin. First of all, how did gave it away? How did muscle get its name? Well, it got its name because the Latin name, it got it from the creature, this guy right here, a mouse, which in Latin is mus musculus. Okay, how did this come about? Well, it came about with this idea that as someone flexed their muscles, it looked as if a little mouse, some little mouse-sized creature, is running about inside. Okay, a large portion of body is muscle, 40%. Okay, and in terms of power, it's really quite amazing. Again, its point is ultimately to produce force, and its ability to produce force is similar in terms of pound for pound, in terms of its ability as a car engine. Okay, so the amount of force it can produce per kilogram is similar to that of a car engine. Quite amazing structure. Um, and meat, what we talk about as meat, is muscle. Now, that doesn't mean that every animal part you eat is muscle. We know that you can get kind of funky, interesting types of meat, especially if you go to some of these Dominican meat trucks around here at night. But generally speaking, when we're eating parts of animal, they are muscles in, I would say, I don't know, 99 times out of 100. All right? One fun little factoid here is, why is filet mignon, okay, so expensive? Why? Well, it's expensive because its meat is extremely pure. Okay, there's very little cartilage or fat within it. It's actually used, or the homologue of filet mignon that you see in animals is referred to is the psoas muscle, P-S-O-A-S, and this muscle is so pure in terms of its composition that it's actually the type of muscle used in doing physiology experiments. Okay? Again, this link between meat and muscle is so strong that the Latin term, I hope it's Latin, not Greek, term for muscle, sarco, is also the term for flesh. Okay? So, now, here I showed you before a diagram of the skeleton. Here's a diagram of muscles. A lot more muscles. You got a lot more muscles than bones. I'm certainly not going to make you memorize this. If we look carefully, though, we'll find somewhere here the biceps. Oh gosh, I don't know if I have time to find it now. I'm sure you can find it. It's somewhere here. I'm just nervous. I can't find it. Anyway, or your gastrocnemius here down in the lower leg. There's your gastrocnemius right there. Okay? And, oh gosh, now it's bugging me. Here's your triceps brachii here, and your, this is embarrassing, there it are, the biceps brachii here. Okay? Many other muscles, most of which, of course, we're not going to be talking about today. But you can see they're all over the body, from head to toe, but not quite the toe and not quite the fingers. The deal is you have muscles that go ultimately up into the hands, okay, and up to the base of the feet, but do not include the fingers and the toes. Now, how then do fingers and toes move? Well, we'll talk about that soon, but trust me, you will get an explanation. Okay, now, different types of muscle, first thing to talk about, especially because in this class we're really going to focus on one, okay, skeletal muscle. So, now how to characterize muscle? Well, there's different ways to do it, but the main thing is basically what kinds of structures they're coming from. So the main types then are three. One is skeletal muscle, basically the muscle that we see that is connected up with our bones. Although it's not just doing that, it's also in structures such as the diaphragm, okay, helping us breathe, and in the eyes, okay, in which there is some connection to bone, but also some connection to other structures, such as the eyeball. Okay? You also have cardiac muscle, responsible for beating of the heart. You also have smooth muscle. Okay? These are, by the way, these are kinds of muscle that we're not going to talk about too much in class, but they might be fun, make for fun term paper discussion. Smooth muscle is muscle in your viscera, in your gut, as well as muscle in your in your blood vessels, okay, that help control blood flow. And so then we can also talk about muscle types in terms of two things: in terms of how they can be controlled, and in terms of their microscopic structure. In terms of the microscopic structure, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle have something in common, basically the striated or striped structure, whereas that kind of structure is not seen in smooth muscle, hence actually the name smooth muscle. How muscle also differs in terms of, can be categorized in terms of how it can be controlled. So only skeletal muscle really can be controlled voluntarily. This other type of muscle, the heart and the guts, can only be controlled involuntarily. Okay, and if you doubt me, sit here now and just try to will your heart to start beating twice as fast. Okay, now if you went running or something like that, that's doing it, but that's indirect. Okay, try to right now make your heart beat twice as fast. If you can do it, you are amazing. Now, getting more into this here. So skeletal muscle is voluntary muscle, but it's also striated. It has these stripes, and you can see them here in this electron. Is this electron or light microscopy? I think this is actually light microscopy. See these striations here, these lines along these muscle cells, and we'll get more into that pretty soon. Okay. Cardiac muscle also has the striated structure, but it is involuntary. Smooth muscle, as you can see, is much less organized. This is an example of a smooth muscle under a light microscope. And it's also involuntary. Now, I'm sort of also putting it then in this kind of grid here, voluntary, involuntary, striated, and smooth. But one point here, okay? Skeletal muscle is the only kind of muscle that is voluntary. But on the other hand, not all skeletal muscle movement is voluntary, okay? At least it's not what you and I would call voluntary. And we'll get more into that later in the class. Okay, yeah, just pointing that out. Now, let's get into muscle anatomy here. Okay, the arrangement of muscle, how the composition of muscles. Okay, so first of all, what we're going to do here is go from big scale to small scale. All right, start off with the big scale. And we're looking here at essentially just here how muscle connects up to bone. So here we have the arm, the elbow system. We have the bicep, which is what we talked about last week, which when you contract makes this elbow joint move one way. And the triceps, when it contracts, will make this elbow joint move the other way. These are connected up to the bone by what we refer to as tendons. Okay? And what we call the origin of the muscle is that connection to the tendon that's closer to the core of the body, or that's more what we refer to as proximal. Okay? The insertion of the muscle is that interface with bone that's more distal, further away from the core of the body. All right? That's one point to make. And the deal here is that when you have movements in one direction, you'll have one muscle serving as what we refer to as the agonist. So here in flexion, here's the bone, as we talked about flexion last week, where this forearm is going up, this joint angle is getting smaller, the biceps is contracting. In that case, the bicep was referred to as the agonist. Okay? And in that same muscle, the triceps, which is now lengthening, will be referred to as the antagonist. So always in skeletal movement, you're going to have some muscles in any particular movement. You're going to have some muscles shortening and some muscles lengthening. In this case, it's more or less one muscle. In case of elbow movement here, it's more or less one movement, one muscle shortening, one movement, one muscle lengthening. In general, it can get a lot more complicated than that. But generally the muscle that's mainly doing the main type of shortening is referred to as the agonist, and the muscle that is lengthening is referred to as the antagonist. Okay, that was flexion. In that case, the biceps was the agonist, and the triceps was the antagonist. But now in extension, now when this elbow is moving the other way, now it's the triceps that's contracting. Now the triceps is serving as the agonist, whereas the biceps in this case is serving as the antagonist. Okay? So whether they serve as agonist or antagonist depends upon whether this muscle is contracting or not. Okay, now what we're doing is getting into smaller and smaller spatial scales in terms of the muscle. And the main first point here is what we call the muscle fiber arrangement. All right, and there's two types, more broadly speaking, there's two types of muscle fiber arrangement. One is referred to as fusiform, and the biceps is probably the best example of that. And the other example is the penniform, or feathered, penne, from I think whatever Greek or Latin term for feather. And our gastrocnemius actually tends to be one of examples there, as well as we see in the deltoid and in the semimembranosus, which I actually have to look up where that is. Okay, so here what's happening, now what's the difference here? So in the fusiform muscle, you have muscle fibers or muscle tissue running parallel to the muscle as a whole. Okay, and you tend to have fewer muscle fibers, but they tend to be longer. All right, we'll get into what exactly we mean by muscle fibers in a second, but I think you know that they're basically these are rope-like structures here. Okay, in a penniform muscle, what you tend to have is more fibers, but they tend to be shorter. Okay, and you see that here. And the deal is, in this case, these fibers are not running in parallel with the muscle as a whole. They're running at some kind of angle with respect to the muscle as a whole. And this can be characterized in these different ways. These two types of muscle, fusiform and penniform, there can be sort of quantified, these different ways that reveal their differences. So one is the fiber lengths, the typical lengths of the fibers in the muscle. As you can see, they tend to be much longer for fusiform than penniform. Second is the anatomical cross-section. This is simply cutting through the muscle, okay? Perpendicular to the fiber, to the way the fibers, or perpendicular to the muscle as a whole, sorry. Okay? And finally, what we also have is what we call the physiological cross-section. What we're doing here now is cutting through the muscle now perpendicular to the way the fibers are running. So in the case of a fusiform muscle, since the fibers are running the same way as the muscle as a whole, the physiological cross-section and anatomical cross-section are the same. But in the penniform muscle now, the fibers are running somewhat differently than the muscle as a whole. And the physiological cross-section there, it's more at an angle with respect to the muscle as a whole, but here again, perpendicular to the way the fibers themselves are running. Okay, these are the two major fibers arrangements that we're going to talk about. They're actually going to have ramifications in terms of what these muscles are specialized in, what kind of movement and force production these muscles are specialized in, as we'll see in the next few lectures. Okay, now we're going to sort of drill down from the muscle from its large scale to the small scale, okay? And the big basic metaphor here to think about here is in terms of strands and strands and strands of strands and strands of strands of strands, or think of muscle as bundles of these linear objects, which are then composed of themselves bundles of objects, etc. Or think about another way to think about it in terms of spaghetti. That you've got grabbing a whole muscle here is like grabbing a big, huge, a whole bunch of different, like a sort of uncooked spaghetti. And there's, but instead of typical spaghetti like you buy at the store, there's sort of bundles of spaghetti and then bundles of spaghetti within that. Okay? So let's kind of let's lead you through this a little bit more carefully now. So at the large scale level, we have the whole muscle. Okay? This is covered by a typical kind of connective tissue referred to as the epimysium. Okay? It's on the surface of the muscle as a whole. Each of these muscles now is composed of these bundles here. And they're bundles over, and each one is referred to as a fascicle. Okay, that's each one of these here, each one of these red blobs here. And this is covered by a structure here then in white, the perimysium. All right? Now, The fascicles then are themselves composed of bundles of these structures, these string-like structures, rope-like structures. And the fascicles are composed of the actual muscle cells. And when we talk about muscle fibers, we're actually referring to the muscle cells themselves. And that's what you're seeing here, one of the components of the fascicle. Okay? And within the muscle cells, then we're going to go more into this a little bit later. You have myofibrils, okay, coming in there. Each of these little strands is a myofibril. And now finally here, when you go to the next level, you're breaking from the spaghetti metaphor because the next is these sarcomeres. So here now when we talk about sarcomeres, we're going now lengthwise along these myofibrils, okay? These little sarcomeres. And within the sarcomeres, we also have structures we refer to as myofilaments, okay? Now, what I want to do, actually, I'm going to stop right there, and then I'm going to pick up next and talk about muscle cells, okay, muscle fibers. So bye-bye.